Far away from the busy heart of the galaxy, in a corner where the stars felt colder and the silence heavier, there lived the last human being alive. Once long ago, his people had filled worlds with laughter, invention, and dreams, but now there was only one. He lived among the ruins of an abandoned outpost, where the walls carried echoes of voices that no longer spoke. Each day was quiet, except for the soft hum of old machines that he had repaired with patient hands. He kept them running not because they were useful, but because they reminded him of what life had once sounded like. Human voices, human music, human stories. Now those things existed only in his memory, and he guarded them with a determination that no hunger or loneliness could take away, that he was not young anymore. Yet his eyes held a strange light, as though carrying the fire of his entire species within them. His body showed the weight of years of survival, scars, tired muscles, and hands worn from work, but his spirit refused to break. Every morning, he would step outside the broken doors of the station and look up at the endless sky, painted with galaxies stretching forever. It was both beautiful and cruel, because it reminded him of the vastness that had swallowed his people. He sometimes spoke aloud to the stars, not expecting anyone to hear. His words were soft, filled with longing. "We were here, remember us." It was not just a plea, but a promise to himself that humanity would not vanish without at least one voice left to carry their memory. His days were filled with simple routines. He gathered food from what little remained of hydroponic gardens, fixed the failing systems of the outpost, and collected water from recycled filters. Every task was slow and careful because there was no one else to do it. If he failed, there would be no second chance. Yet he did not despair. Each small success felt like a quiet act of defiance against the void, a way of saying, humanity still endures. But when the sun of that distant star set, and the quiet darkness returned, the weight of solitude pressed against his heart. Nights were hardest, when silence stretched so long it seemed to swallow the mind. To keep it away, he would sit with an old transmitter, one of the last machines that still worked, and broadcast his voice into the stars that he did not know if anyone could hear him. The signals were weak, broken, carried on old frequencies that most civilizations no longer used. Still he spoke. He told stories of his people, of the world they once called home, with oceans that danced under sunlight, forests that sang with birds, and cities filled with voices. He told stories of courage, when humans had stood together against impossible odds. He even told stories of laughter, of small joys like sharing meals, holding hands, and watching children play. His words carried warmth, even if no one answered. They were his way of keeping humanity alive, not through force or power, but through memory and hope. Sometimes, as he spoke, he imagined that somewhere out there, a curious traveler might pause and hear his voice. Perhaps they would wonder about these strange beings called humans who had lived, loved, and dreamed so fiercely. Perhaps they would remember that a species is never truly gone as long as someone speaks their name. These thoughts gave him strength, like a fragile flame that refused to be extinguished. Though he lived alone, he did not let despair consume him. Instead, he found beauty in small things. The sound of rain against the broken roof during storms made him smile, because it reminded him of Earth. The glow of stars on quiet nights comforted him, because he thought of how many humans before him had once looked at the same stars with wonder. Even the silence of the outpost felt sacred sometimes, like a library holding the last echoes of his kind. He would place his hand on the cold walls and whisper, "We are not forgotten." There were moments, however, when the loneliness was heavy enough to break even his strong heart. He would sit in the dim light and close his eyes, remembering faces that no longer existed. The laughter of friends, the warmth of family, the closeness of touch, all of it now only lived in memory. Tears came often, but he did not hide them, for there was no one to hide them from. Instead, he let them fall, because each tear was proof that humanity had once loved deeply enough to leave behind such pain. Yet even in sorrow, he always returned to hope. He believed that one day someone somewhere would hear his stories and know that humans had once walked the stars. He did not think of himself as a hero or a survivor. He thought of himself simply as a witness, carrying a flame in the darkness. His strength was not in his body, but in his refusal to let the silence of extinction erase the voices of his kind. On one quiet night, after sending another story into the void, he sat outside under the sky. The stars shimmered, cold and distant, but he felt strangely close to them. "If you hear me," he whispered to the universe, "remember that we were here. Remember that we dreamed. Remember that we loved." His voice was soft, carried by the winds of a forgotten world, and though he believed no one listened, something far away stirred. A signal had escaped, faint but alive, drifting across the cosmos. And in a distant place, among alien ears, a voice began to be heard. The human did not know it yet, but his words were no longer lost. The silence of extinction was beginning to break, and the universe, long indifferent, was about to remember the people it thought were gone forever. The signal was faint, almost like a whisper lost in the great sea of stars, but it was not lost completely. For years, the last human had been speaking into the void, unsure if his words reached anyone, yet never giving up. What he did not know was that one evening, when the skies stretched clear and the universe seemed quieter than usual, his voice finally brushed against the edge of an alien receiver. Far away, in a corner of the galaxy where ships glided between worlds and civilizations bustled with life, a group of explorers picked up a fragile transmission. At first, they thought it was only static, another random echo from ancient machines, but then they paused, for hidden in the crackle was a voice. It was soft, trembling at times, yet steady enough to carry meaning. It told of oceans, forests, laughter, and the courage of a people now gone. For the aliens who heard it, the words were like a spark of warmth in the cold vastness of space. The explorers replayed the message again and again, each time catching new fragments. They had heard many signals from other worlds before, but none carried the same weight. This one was different. It was personal, filled not with commands or warnings, but with stories. The voice spoke with care, as though speaking not only to strangers but to time itself. The aliens leaned closer, listening to descriptions of a blue planet, where skies burned with sunrises and waters mirrored the heavens. They heard of children's laughter, of families gathering around meals, of songs sung under the night sky. Though they had never met a human, they could feel something familiar in the words, something that touched the same longing within their own hearts. News of the strange voice spread quickly across their networks. Scholars, leaders, and travelers gathered to study it, debating what kind of being could speak in such a way. Some believed it was a recording from a species already lost, a ghost carried by broken machines. Others argued it was alive, still sending signals into the void, hoping for an answer. The idea that someone might be out there, alone yet unbroken, filled many with both sorrow and admiration. They had seen species rise and fall before, but never had they heard a voice that refused to let itself fade into silence. This was not only a cry for remembrance, it was a living thread of survival. Among those who listened most closely was an old alien historian. He had studied countless civilizations, their ruins and their records, but he had never heard a voice like this. Each time he listened, he felt a deep stirring inside him, as though the voice carried not only memories but emotions strong enough to cross light years. He told others, "This is not just history. This is life refusing to be forgotten." And slowly, more and more people began to believe him. Entire gatherings were held where the voice was played aloud, echoing in halls filled with beings of every shape and size. Some closed their eyes while listening, imagining the world described. Some wept quietly, touched by the simple beauty of the words. For the first time, humanity's presence returned, not through armies or power, but through the quiet strength of one man's voice. Meanwhile, on the lonely outpost where the last human lived, he continued his routine without knowing the stir he had caused. He repaired machines, tended to what little food he could grow, and in the evenings he sat before the transmitter, speaking once again. On that particular night, he spoke about hope. "Even if no one hears me," he whispered, "I believe that one day someone will. And if they do, they will know that we were here. That we dreamed of more, that we were more than dust. That we loved." His words traveled once again into the void, fragile but determined, and though he believed he was still alone, across the stars' hearts were listening. The aliens who had first caught the signal decided they could not let it remain only as an echo. They traced its origin, searching the endless sky for a point of origin. The task was difficult. The signal was weak, scattered by distance and time, but determination guided them. For every failure, they tried again, piecing together coordinates with patience. The historian who believed so deeply urged them on, saying, "If even one human remains, then their story is not finished." The thought of finding a living remnant of such a species filled the explorers with purpose. And so slowly, they drew closer to discovering the lonely outpost. Back on that quiet station, the human began to feel something unusual. His old machines flickered in ways they hadn't before, picking up faint disturbances in the skies above. He looked out, scanning the stars with weary eyes, and for a moment he thought perhaps it was his imagination. Still, he felt a stirring in his chest, a sense that the silence of the universe was changing. He returned to his transmitter and spoke again, this time not just with memory, but with a strange sense of connection. "If you are there," he said softly, "know that I am still here too. I am waiting." Those words, carried by fragile signals, reached the explorers, and when they heard them, their halls fell silent. This was not a ghost, not a recording of the past, but a living voice calling from the present. Joy rippled among them, and awe filled their hearts. Against all odds, humanity had not fully vanished. The last ember still burned, faint but alive. They knew then that they had to find him, not only to meet the last of his kind, but to honor the memory of a species that had given so much to the galaxy, often without being recognized. The human, unaware of how close they were, continued his nightly broadcasts, speaking as though to unseen friends. In truth, they had become friends to him, stars that might someday answer. He poured his heart into the stories, each one filled with hope that life, even when fragile, was still worth remembering. And somewhere out in the galaxy, for the first time in generations, beings of countless worlds whispered the word human once more, not as a forgotten chapter, but as a living reminder of resilience. The silence that had once seemed endless was now broken. The voice of the last human had stirred the stars, and in that stirring, the universe began to listen, to remember, and to reach back. The human sat in his small outpost, his voice drifting once again into the endless sea of stars, not knowing that his words were no longer lost. Across the galaxy, countless beings had heard him. They listened to his memories, his hopes, and his quiet strength, and in his voice, they found something they had not felt for a long time. They felt the warmth of family, the beauty of kindness, and the power of love. Civilizations that had once thought themselves too busy for such simple things now paused to listen. Leaders who usually spoke of trade and war instead asked their people to gather and hear the fragile transmissions of a human who refused to let his kind be forgotten. Slowly, his words became more than just a voice. They became a reminder that life, no matter how fragile, could shine brighter than any star when spoken with truth and heart. As the signal spread farther, more species tuned in, curious about the sound of a single human keeping his world alive through memory. Some wept when they heard about the laughter of children he once knew. Others smiled at his stories of sunlight on the ocean or the way the wind would dance through forests. Entire communities played his broadcasts in open spaces where people gathered in silence, watching the stars as his voice carried them into another world. In time, he was no longer just a human speaking into the void. He became a storyteller for the galaxy. His loneliness reached others, but it did not make them turn away. Instead, it brought them closer, because they too knew what it felt like to long for connection, to fear being forgotten, and to wish that someone somewhere remembered their story. Meanwhile, the explorers who had first discovered him worked tirelessly to find the source of the transmissions. It was not easy. Space was vast, and his signal was faint, but they never stopped. Every time they replayed his words, they found strength to continue. The old historian who believed so deeply in the voice reminded them that what they were searching for was not only a man, but a symbol of resilience. "If we find him," he said, "we will not just be meeting a survivor. We will be keeping alive everything his people stood for." That belief kept them going, even when calculations failed or signals seemed to disappear. They knew they were chasing something greater than themselves, a story that deserved to live. Back at the outpost, the last human continued with his quiet life. He repaired old machines, tended his small garden, and sometimes sat by the window, staring at the stars. He often wondered if his words were carried anywhere at all. Sometimes doubt whispered to him, but each time he shook it away, choosing instead to believe. "Even if the universe never answers," he told himself, "I will keep speaking, because my people deserve to be remembered." What he did not know was that his choice to keep believing had already changed everything. The universe was listening, and then one evening, something extraordinary happened. As he sat before his transmitter, ready to share another story, a faint sound came through the static. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but then he heard it again. It was not his voice, and it was not empty noise. It was a reply. The voice was strange, unlike any human tone, but it carried meaning. It said simply, "We hear you." He froze, tears filling his eyes, unable to believe what he had just heard. For so long, he had been alone, his words swallowed by silence. Now, finally, the silence had answered back. That single moment changed everything. The message of his survival spread like fire through the networks of distant worlds. Entire fleets offered to help reach him, not out of conquest or curiosity, but out of respect. They wanted to meet the human who had kept speaking when all others had fallen silent. They wanted to look into his eyes and tell him that he was not forgotten, that his people's story would be carried forward. For the first time in his life of loneliness, he knew he was no longer truly alone. When the explorers finally found his outpost, it was not a grand army that arrived, but a ship carrying beings who came with open hands and open hearts. They stepped onto the station carefully, as though walking into a sacred place. And when they finally stood before him, they did not see just a man. They saw the last ember of a people who had given songs, art, laughter, and love to the universe. They bowed their heads, not out of duty, but out of gratitude. He, the last human, had reminded them all of something they had almost forgotten. That strength was not in numbers or in power, but in the ability to hold on to hope even when hope seemed lost. From that day on, the story of humanity was no longer only his to carry. Across worlds, schools taught the tales he shared, songs were sung with human words woven into alien music, and monuments were built not of stone, but of memory. Wherever his voice had reached, hearts carried it forward. The galaxy understood now why humans had once guarded their own so fiercely. It was not only because they were strong or clever. It was because they loved. They protected each other because to them, every life mattered. That lesson spread farther than ships could travel, reaching places where no human had ever stepped. The man himself was changed too. No longer did he speak into an empty void. Now he spoke to friends across the stars, and in return, they spoke back. He taught them what he knew of Earth, its songs, its stories, its kindness. And in return, they taught him of their worlds, their dreams, and their hopes. He was still the last, but he was no longer alone. His people lived on in the way others remembered them, in the way others carried their lessons into the future. Humanity had not disappeared. It had become part of something greater, something eternal that in the end. The universe could not forget humanity, not because of wars fought or power gained, but because of a single human who refused to let silence win. His voice had stirred the stars, his hope had reached across time and space, and his story had reminded countless beings that love, kindness, and memory are the strongest forces of all. And as he looked out at the skies once more, no longer lonely but filled with peace, he whispered, "We are remembered." And in every corner of the galaxy, from the smallest child to the oldest elder, that truth was carried on like light, soft, eternal, and unbroken.